The old woman moved slowly across the stone floor, her rubber boots making a soft, deliberate sound against the granite with each step. She was 84 years old, and she moved the way old people sometimes move, not with hesitation, but with the certainty of someone who has decided that each step matters and is worth taking properly, not rushing, not shuffling, moving with the full weight of a long life behind every footfall. The mill room was alive in a way it had not been in 60 years. Water moved through the stone archway beneath the floor channeled by the mill race Calla had cleared of 60 years of debris, running fast and purposeful through the fitted stone and out again into the creek on the other side of the building. The great wheel on the creek side turned in the morning light, dripping silver arcs into the current below each paddle, coming over the top, heavy with water, and releasing it in a cascade before rising again to meet the flow. And the grinding stones, 2 circles of dark granite, each one quarried from the mountains by a man long dead and shaped by his hands to fit against its partner, were rotating, slowly, heavily, with a sound like thunder stored underground for decades and finally permitted to come out. The old woman walked to the center of the room and placed both hands flat on the upper stone. The stone moved beneath her palms just slightly, the imperceptible creep of something enormous, turning with patience and purpose. She spread her fingers against it. She closed her eyes. Calla Merritt stood in the mill room doorway and watched her. Calla was 18 years old, and she had owned this mill for 5 months, and she still did not entirely understand how any of this had happened. She had rebuilt the roof herself, carrying shingles up a 2-mile trail on her back in loads of 50 pounds. She had glazed 8 windows fitting each pane of glass into its stone frame with putty she worked in with her thumb until the seals held. She had replaced 3 rotted rafters, relaid the chestnut plank floor, and coaxed cold mountain water from the creek through 40 feet of copper pipe to a hand pump she had installed by reading the instruction manual 3 times and then twice more before she trusted herself to cut the first fitting. She had done all of this alone with her own 2 hands, with money she had found under the floorboards of a building she had purchased for $10 from the Madison County tax roll. And now this woman, this 84-year-old woman in rubber boots and a wide-brimmed sun hat who brought sourwood honey every 2 weeks and walked 2 miles of mountain trail without being winded and never called ahead because there was no way to call ahead, was standing at the center of the mill room with her eyes closed and her palms flat against the turning grinding stone and her lips pressed together in an expression that was almost a smile and almost a grief, and was entirely something Calla had no single word for. A tear moved down the old woman's cheek. It moved the way tears move on very old faces, not quickly, not with drama, not with the urgency of a younger person's crying. It moved slowly the way water moves through old stone, finding its path through the lines that 78 years of weather and work and loss and laughter had carved into the skin. It reached her jaw and dropped and was gone. The grinding stones kept turning. The wheel kept turning. Outside, the creek ran over its bed of smooth stone, cold and clear and indifferent, the same sound it had been making in this valley since before anyone arrived to hear it. To understand this moment, to understand what it meant for an 84-year-old woman to stand in that room with her eyes closed, listening with her hands to something that had been silent for 60 years, you need to go back. Not far in terms of calendar years, far in terms of what a life can hold in a short time when circumstances require it. You need to go back to a Thursday morning in February, to a gravel road that ended at a trailhead sign in the Madison County mountains, and further back than that, to a black garbage bag on a porch in Asheville, and further back still to a girl who had spent the better part of 18 years learning the particular discipline of making herself disappear. The mill did not begin with Calla Merritt. It began in the winter of 1871 with a man named Ezra Witt, who was 31 years old and had come to the Laurel Creek Valley in Madison County, North Carolina, with a mule across cut, saw a set of cold chisels of graduated sizes and a skill that his father had spent 20 years teaching him, and that his father's father had possessed before that the ability to read stone. Not the way a geologist reads stone, looking for age and chemistry and the deep narrative of planetary time. The way a builder reads stone, standing in front of a face of exposed granite and seeing inside it the grain, the cleavage planes, the places where the stone wanted to split cleanly, and the places where it would fight you and shatter wrong if you didn't respect what it was telling you. Looking at a rough creek stone and seeing the flat face hidden inside it, the weight it could bear the way it wanted to sit against its neighbors, and how much force it could absorb before it decided it had enough. Ezra Witt had been reading stone since he could walk alongside his father on a construction site, and he came to Laurel Creek with a specific purpose. The creek dropped 40 feet of elevation in the half-mile above the sharp bend where it turned around a granite outcropping the size of a small house, and that drop over that distance, at the volume the creek ran, even in the dry months of August and September, was enough to turn a wheel, a mill wheel, the kind of wheel his grandfather had run in Yancey County for 20 years and that his father had used as the economic spine of the community he built around it, a place where people brought grain and left with flour, and the difference between the grain and the flour was what kept the mill running. He spent the summer of 1871 selecting stones from the creek bed before he laid a single one. This was not impatience with the project. This was the project. He walked the creek for 3 miles in each direction, morning after morning, crouching down in the shallows, with his trousers rolled up and his boots set on the bank, lifting and turning each stone he found interesting, pressing it against his cheek to feel the surface, holding it up to the light, to read the grain, setting it aside on a dry section of bank if it had what he needed, or returning it to the water if it didn't. Some days he kept 6 stones, some days he kept 2. One day in July, after walking 5 miles of creek in the early morning heat, he kept none at all, and walked back to camp in the late afternoon with empty hands and the particular satisfaction of a man who understands that the work of selection is as real as the work of building. He built without mortar. This decision puzzled the men from Hot Springs who came out to watch him work, because mortar was what you used. Mortar was how walls held together. Mortar was the medium through which individual stones became a unified structure, the thing that took the place of the mathematical precision required to make dry-laid stonework. Ezra Witt did not argue with their reasoning. He simply continued to build without mortar, placing each stone against its neighbors, with the care of a man who understood that the strength of a dry-laid wall comes from the same place. The strength of a chain comes from every link bearing against every other link, no single point carrying more than its share, the whole thing distributing its load so evenly that a wall built this way can outlast a mortared wall by centuries. Because mortar fails, mortar cracks and crumbles and lets the water in. Stone properly placed against stone does not fail. It simply holds. The walls went up slowly. 6 months for the lower story, which rose directly from the creek bed on the bedrock foundation, the water flowing through the archway he left in the rear wall, the current providing both the power source and the natural cooling that kept the stone of the lower room perpetually cool, even in the hottest summers. 4 more months for the upper story, which would serve as living quarters, a single room with windows on all 4 sides and a stone fireplace against the back wall and a wooden staircase in the corner that Ezra built from locust, because locust was the hardest wood in these mountains, and he wanted the staircase to outlast the building if that was what the future decided. He quarried the grinding stones from an outcropping of fine-grained granite half a mile up the ridge above the mill. The quarrying alone took a month, cutting the stone free from the face with wedge and hammer, rough shaping it into the circular form, smoothing the working surfaces with smaller chisels until the grain of the stone was consistent and the two faces, upper and lower, would mate with the precision of a fitted joint. He and a hired man from Hot Springs brought each stone down the ridge on a wooden sled, using the mule to break the descent, taking 3 days per stone, with 3 close calls that Ezra would describe years later with the equanimity of a man who has survived enough close calls to stop treating each one as an event. He built the water wheel from white oak 12 feet in diameter, the rim and spokes mortise and tenon with wooden pegs, the way the old wheelwrights built them, the paddles shaped to catch the water cleanly and release it before the wheel had turned far enough that the weight of the water on the ascending side would fight the wheel's direction. He hung it on iron brackets he had forged himself in the smithy at Hot Springs, driving the 12 miles twice to get the metalwork right and carrying the brackets back on the mule each time. He connected the wheel's axle through the stone wall to the wooden gear assembly he had built inside the mill room, the gears connecting the horizontal rotation of the wheel to the vertical axis of the upper grinding stone, converting the slow power of the wheel into the slow grinding force the stones required. When he finally opened the sluice gate in the fall of 1871 and the creek water hit the paddles for the first time and the wheel began to move, everything worked the way it was supposed to. Not perfectly, the mill race needed adjustment, and one of the gear pegs split under the first load and had to be replaced, and the upper grinding stone needed redressing before it produced flour of the quality he wanted. But the wheel turned and the stones turned, and by the first harvest that followed, the farmers of Laurel Creek Valley had a place to bring their grain. Ezra Witt ran the mill for 33 years until the winter of 1904 left him slower and more careful about everything, and it was clear that the mill's next phase required a younger man's strength. His son Harlan took over then. Harlan Witt had inherited his father's patience, but not his father's reticence. Harlan was a talker, a man who understood that the mill was as much a social institution as a mechanical one, that the farmers who brought their grain up the trail were also bringing their news and their worries and their sense of what was happening in the valley and in the world beyond it, and that a miller who listened well and said the right things was providing a service beyond the flour. He ground grain and he kept his own counsel, and he never repeated what one man told him to another, which in a mountain community is the whole of what it means to be trusted. He ran the mill through the years when the valley changed around it. The timber companies came in the first decade of the century and stripped the hillsides above Laurel Creek and left them raw and prone to flooding, and then they moved on to the next valley and the next after that, and the forest came back slowly, the way forests do. First, the pioneer species, the sun-hungry poplars and the briars and the black locusts, then the slower-growing hardwoods behind them, reclaiming the hillsides decade by decade with a patience that made human impatience look like a brief strange weather event. He ran the mill through the Depression. This is worth sitting with for a moment because the Depression in these mountains was not the same as the Depression in the cities. The cities had bread lines and closed banks and men in suits standing on corners selling apples. The mountains had people who had always been poor and were now poorer people who had always lived close to the margin and were now right at it. People who had managed to feed themselves through the subsistence agriculture of a mountain farm and were now being tested on whether that subsistence would hold. It held mostly because of the mill. Not only Witt Mill, there were other mills in the county, other grinding operations in other valleys. But in the Laurel Creek watershed, Harlan Witt's mill was the thing that stood between a bad harvest and genuine hunger. He ground on shares as his father had, and he never adjusted the shares when times were hard. A man who brought a bushel of corn to the mill got 9/10 of a bushel of cornmeal back and left 1/10 with Harlan. This was true in 1929, and it was true in 1932, and it was true in 1936 when the rains were bad and the corn yield was a third of what it should have been. Harlan Witt did not discuss the economics of this. He ground the grain and sent the families home. He ran the mill until 1921 when his legs began giving him the kind of trouble that cannot be reasoned with, and his youngest son, Silas, came home from a job in Asheville and took over in the way that the youngest son in a family sometimes takes over, not because it was expected of him, not because he had no other options, but because he looked at the mill and saw what it was and understood that someone who saw it that way should be the one to run it. Silas Witt was 31 years old when he became the miller, which was the same age his grandfather Ezra had been when he built the mill, though Silas would not know this for another decade, when he found Ezra's construction records in a tin box in the lower level and read them by lamplight one winter evening with the creek murmuring beneath him and the fire burning in the upstairs hearth. He was a precise man, not cold. He had his father's gift for making people feel heard, but precise in the way that people who work with their hands every day become precise. He knew the difference between a well-dressed millstone and a stone that needed work. He could hear in the sound of the grinding when the flour was going to come out coarse and when it was going to come out fine. He could tell from the weight of a bag of grain whether the kernels had dried properly before being shelled, and he would tell the farmer gently, because moisture in the grain was bad for the flour, and he wanted the flour to be right. He ground grain for the people of the valley, the way a country doctor practices medicine in a small town, not as a transaction, not even as a service in the commercial sense, but as something closer to a relationship. Farmers knew Silas, and Silas knew the farmers, and they knew each other's families, and each other's land, and each other's particular struggles, and the mill was the place where this knowing happened. People didn't just drop off their grain. They stayed while Silas ground it, sitting on the flat stones beside the creek or inside the mill room when it was cold, talking about the weather and the harvest and the price of seed corn and the general condition of the world, which Silas listened to with attention and responded to with economy. He ran the mill for 41 years. In the spring of 1958 in April, Silas Witt climbed the narrow, locust staircase to the living quarters above the mill room. For perhaps the 10,000th time in his life walked to the fireplace and knelt on the chestnut plank floor. He had swept and oiled and replaced boards in and lived on for most of his adult life. He lifted a series of loose planks he had prepared over several weeks in the late winter, working on them in the evenings when the light was good. He lowered a wooden crate into the cavity between the floor and the ceiling of the mill room below. Inside the crate were 12 mason jars, sealed with zinc lids and packed in wax canvas, and a leather pouch containing a folded piece of paper on which he had written carefully and in full what he wanted whoever came next to know. He replaced the planks. He pressed each one down until it sat flush against its neighbors and showed nothing to the eye or the foot that would suggest it had ever been lifted. He stood up. He was 68 years old, and his knees made the standing difficult, but he stood all the way upright before he walked back to the staircase. He went downstairs. He put a bag of corn on the millstone feed. He ground another bushel. He died in 1962 in the mill in the room where he had slept for 41 years, with the creek running beneath him and the wheels still attached to the building and the stones waiting on their frame in the room below. He was the last person to occupy the building for a very long time. The mill fell silent when Silas Witt died, and it did not make another purposeful sound for 62 years. Calla Merritt was small, not just young though she was. That too, she was 18 years old in the February when the story that matters begins. Physically small, the kind of small that is genetic and fundamental and does not respond to nutrition or exercise or time in any meaningful way. She was the kind of person who got overlooked in rooms, not because she lacked presence, but because her presence was quiet, and quiet things get overlooked by a world that has decided volume is the same as importance. At 12, she could pass for 9. At 15, she passed for 12. At 18, theater employees still carded her at PG-13 movies and examined her license with the skepticism of people encountering a document that tells them something they can't quite believe. She had grown up in Asheville, North Carolina, in a house in the north part of the city that belonged to her stepfather, Boyd Sutter. Boyd installed seamless gutters for a living. He drove a white pickup truck with Sutter seamless gutter systems and stick-on vinyl letters on both doors, the kind of truck that becomes, after years of seeing it in a driveway, less a vehicle than a feature of the landscape, like the cracked concrete at the end of the walk or the one loose shutter on the second floor that nobody had fixed. Boyd was not a large man and not an obviously frightening one. He had brown hair that was going gray at the sides and the kind of ordinary face that doesn't print itself clearly in the memory after you stop looking at it. He drank bourbon, not in the falling down way, not in the obvious way, but in the sustained and deliberate way of someone who has decided that bourbon is how the day ends every day without exception. He and Calla's mother, Verna Merritt, had married when Calla was 7 years old. Verna was a woman of 40-odd years who had once, in the version of herself that existed before the marriage, dreamed seriously of becoming a veterinarian. This was not a small ambition or a vague one. She had studied for it. She had kept on the shelf above the washing machine in every apartment she had lived in before Boyd's house a copy of a veterinary anatomy textbook that she had bought used from a classmate at the community college where she had taken prerequisite courses. The book was thick and serious, with diagrams of skeletal and muscular systems and notation in multiple colors, and her own pencil annotations in the margins. The handwriting of a woman engaged in something, paying attention to something, becoming something specific through the application of sustained effort. Calla had found the book when she was 9 and spent an hour with it paging through the diagram, and had thought about the woman who had made those careful notes in the margins as if that woman were a stranger, because in some essential sense she was. What Verna had become instead was invisible. Not literally. She moved through the house, she prepared meals, she answered questions when directly addressed, she was physically present. But she had learned to occupy the minimum possible space, to make the minimum possible noise, to avoid the specific configuration of behavior that triggered the particular quality of Boyd's coldness that was worse than anger. Boyd did not hit. Boyd did not shout. What Boyd did instead was withdraw in a way that changed the temperature of a room, a deliberate, controlled withdrawal that communicated with absolute clarity that you had failed at something, that your presence was a problem, that the air you were displacing would be better used by someone else. The coldness was a choice he made and maintained with the consistency of a man who has decided on a method and found it effective. Verna had made herself small against this coldness, and Calla had watched Verna make herself small and had learned. She learned to eat without making noise, not eating slowly, not eating carefully, but eating in the particular way that produces no scraping of fork against plate, no inadvertent sound of swallowing, no evidence beyond the gradual disappearance of food from the dish that a person is consuming a meal. She learned to walk through the house in a way that did not cause floorboards to announce her passage. She had memorized the safe boards on the staircase before she was 10, the ones that compressed without sound against the joists, and she used them with the consistency of muscle memory. She learned to close doors without the latch clicking, pressing the handle down, before the door met the frame and releasing it with such control that the mechanism engaged silently every time. She learned to read a room from the hallway before she entered it, the quality of the silence, the position of the television sound, the particular absence of sound that meant Boyd was sitting in the kitchen with a glass and a mood, and to decide from this reading whether entering was advisable. She became by 12 exceptionally good at not being noticed. The one person in her life who had pushed against this, who had actively, consistently, with genuine warmth and some mild exasperation, encouraged Calla to take up more space, make more noise, occupy more of the room she was in, was her grandmother, Loretta Merritt Verna's mother, a woman who had lived for most of her adult life on a small farm in Watauga County, a 2-hour drive from Asheville, in a farmhouse that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and the particular sweetness of old apples kept in a root cellar beneath the kitchen. Loretta was 67 when Calla was small and 78 when she died, and in those 11 years of regular visits, holidays, and summer weeks, and the occasional long weekend when Verna needed a reason to leave the house on the north side of Asheville, for a few days Calla had been given something she did not have the vocabulary for until years later. She had been given the experience of being fully seen. Loretta looked at Calla the way people look at something they find genuinely interesting. She asked questions that required more than one-word answers. She listened to the answers with the quality of attention that makes the person answering feel that what they are saying matters, that their specific way of seeing the world is worth the time it takes to receive it. She laughed in a way that took up the whole room, a generous, unself-conscious laugh that made no apology for its volume, and created in whoever was nearby, when it happened, the involuntary sense that something good was occurring. She kept a Bible on the kitchen table, the kind that had been read until the spine cracked in 3 places, and the pages had the soft, slightly rounded feel of paper that has been touched many thousands of times. The margins were full of her handwriting in pencil, and occasionally in blue pen notes going back decades, notations that tracked the changes in her thinking over 50 years of reading the same passages with different things behind her eyes each time. In the summer of Calla's 15th year, at the end of a week at the Watauga County farmhouse, on the afternoon before Verna arrived to collect her, Loretta had pressed a coin into Calla's palm, an old silver dollar, the surface worn smooth from years of handling the date, 1922, still legible if you tilted it in the light. The eagle on the reverse was soft with age, its detail dissolved by the patient friction of pockets and palms. "That belonged to your great-grandfather," Loretta said. "He earned it on the first day he worked for real wages when he was 17 years old, and he kept it the rest of his life. It came to me from your grandfather, and now it comes to you." She closed Calla's fingers around it. "Don't spend it. Keep it somewhere close. When things are hard, hold it, and remember that somebody worked hard and kept something real and passed it forward into a future they couldn't see. That's worth something." Calla had kept it in a sock at the bottom of her backpack ever since. She took the backpack everywhere, including on the nights when Boyd's mood settled over the house like a change in atmospheric pressure that everyone felt without anyone naming to the bathroom. 2 years before Boyd changed the locks on the front door, Loretta Merritt died in her sleep at the Watauga County farmhouse on a night in late October. She was 78 years old, and the doctor said her heart had simply stopped quietly and without struggle, which everyone who knew her agreed was consistent with who she was. The funeral was on a Saturday in the first week of November in a Methodist church in a small town in the mountains, and the pews were full because Loretta had lived in the same community for 50 years and had been exactly the same person in that community as she was at her kitchen table, which is not as common as it should be. Calla stood at the graveside in a wind off the mountains and felt something go out of the world that she could not name and did not try to name. She held the silver dollar in the pocket of her jacket through the whole of the service and the burial and the meal afterward in the church hall, her fingers turning it slowly against her palm. She was right that what she had lost would not come back. She was wrong, though she had no way to know this yet, about whether something would eventually come to occupy the space it left. She had started working at Grain and Honey, the bakery on Lexington Avenue, when she was 16. The job had come through a school bulletin board, a handwritten index card with Opal Dearborn's phone number on it, and Calla had called from the school library and gotten the job in a 3-minute conversation in which Opal asked 2 questions. Can you get here by 4:30? And do you have any problem with lifting? And then said, come Monday. The job was sweeping floors, washing sheet pans, and loading the display cases before 7 in the morning, after which Calla walked the 6 blocks to school, still smelling of bread. Opal Dearborn was 62 years old and had been baking bread since she was 8 years old, which made 54 years of it, and the physical evidence of those years was visible in her forearms. Compact and precise, the muscles developed through the specific demands of bread work, the sustained pressure of needing the repetitive lifting of heavy pans, the particular strength required to manage 60-pound bags of flour on a daily basis without incident. She was not a large woman in any other sense, but her forearms would surprise you if you met her somewhere without context. She called everyone sugar, not as a verbal tic, not as a southern affectation performed without intention, but as an actual expression of genuine warmth, the way some people say thank you and some people say friend, and the word means what it says each time they say it. She paid Calla $9 an hour in cash and asked no questions about why a 16-year-old showed up at 4:30 every morning without needing to be told twice, and never called in sick, and always had her backpack with her, including on the days when the temperature in Asheville made a heavy backpack obviously uncomfortable. Opal had noticed things about Calla that Calla had not told her: the backpack always present, the habit of sitting with her back to the wall when she ate her morning bread, the way her eyes made a brief assessment of the room when she first came in each day, not anxious, not fearful, but alert, in the specific way of someone who has learned that environments can change when you're not watching them, and has decided the cost of staying aware is less than the cost of being surprised. Opal did not ask about these things. She ensured there was always something warm for Calla to eat before her shift started, and she paid her on time, and she treated her the way she tried to treat everyone, as if they had every legitimate right to be exactly where they were. Calla had $214 when Boyd Sutter changed the locks. $214 in a Ziploc bag inside the sock, with the silver dollar in the front pocket of the backpack she carried everywhere. The bills were mostly 5s and 10s, some ones accumulated over 2 years of early mornings at Grain and Honey saved, with the discipline of someone who understood, at some level below articulation, at the level of the body's own knowledge, that the bag might someday be the difference between a bad situation and a catastrophic one. She also had the silver dollar. She did not count the silver dollar as money. The silver dollar was something else. It happened on a Thursday in February. She had been at school all day and had taken the bus home the way she took the bus home every day, 14 minutes, the city moving past the window in the particular flatness of a February afternoon, the mountains visible behind the buildings whenever the buildings gave them room. She walked the 2 blocks from the bus stop to the house on the north side of Asheville, with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes down against a wind that had been coming off the ridges to the east all week, the kind of cold that finds your collar no matter how you have adjusted it. She turned onto the street and saw it from 40 feet away, a black garbage bag, centered on the front porch directly in front of the door, not tucked to the side or placed with any ambiguity, centered the way you place something when you want it to be seen from the street. She stopped on the sidewalk. She was not surprised. She would think about this later. The fact of not being surprised and understand that it was the most honest thing she could say about her years in that house. She had been waiting for this, not consciously and not with dread she could point to, but in the low background register of a person who knows which direction the weather is coming from and has been watching the sky for a long time. She walked to the porch and tried the front door. Locked. She could hear the television through the front wall, a game show, the audience applauding something, a repeated burst of mechanical enthusiasm. Boyd's white pickup sat in the driveway. She looked at the Sutter's seamless gutter systems lettering on the door. The S in Sutter had been peeling at the lower corner for at least 8 months. She had noticed it every day, and it had always been there, a small evidence of maintenance deferred. And it occurred to her, standing on the porch in February, that she was probably looking at it for the last time. She stood there for 3 minutes. She counted without deciding to count, which is what the mind does when the body needs time to arrive at a decision it already knows it has made. She did not knock. This is important. She stood on that porch in the February cold with a locked door 1.5 feet from her face, and she did not knock on it, did not call Boyd's name through the glass, did not try her mother's cell phone while standing in view of the front windows. She understood with the understanding that comes from years of learning how specific people work, that knocking on that door would not open it, that whatever was on the other side had been arranged and decided before she came home from school, that she was standing not before a decision, but in the aftermath of one, and that the person who had made the decision was watching the game show and had no intention of coming to the door. She picked up the garbage bag. It was lighter than it should have been for the sum of her belongings, which told her something about what had and hadn't been included: her winter coat, 2 pairs of jeans, several shirts, and a sweater, a paperback she was midway through from the school library, and the veterinary anatomy textbook from the shelf above the washing machine, the one with the pencil annotations in the margins from the woman her mother used to be. Calla had taken it 2 years earlier quietly when it became clear that Verna no longer looked at it and would not notice its absence. She did not feel guilty about this. She felt like she was preserving something that would otherwise be lost, the way you sometimes preserve things that belong to people who have stopped being able to care for them. Everything she actually needed was already in the backpack: the Ziploc bag, the silver dollar, her phone and its charger, a library card, a photograph of Loretta taken at the Watauga County farmhouse in the summer before she died. Loretta laughing, both hands raised, some joke just delivered, the farmhouse golden in the afternoon light behind her and the mountains behind that. She shouldered the backpack. She picked up the garbage bag. She walked down the porch steps without looking back at the door. Would you knock on a door you already knew wouldn't open? She took the bus downtown. She sat by the window and watched Asheville move past the restaurants and coffee shops and galleries that the city had become over the past 2 decades, the reclaimed wood and chalkboard menus, and the mountains visible behind everything whenever the storefronts stepped back far enough to let them through. She had grown up in the city, but she had never entirely belonged to the version of it that was becoming most visible. She was always the wrong time of day, too early in the morning or too late at night, always the girl sweeping the floor while everyone else was still asleep. The bus stopped a block from Lexington Avenue. The lights at Grain and Honey were on. Through the front window, she could see the warm yellow of the interior and the shapes of things behind the glass display cases. She pushed the door open. The bell above it rang, and the smell of the place reached her immediately. Bread and warm butter, and the rich, yeasty aliveness of something fermented and well-tended, and something in her chest that had been clenched since she saw the garbage bag on the porch loosened by a fraction. Opal was at the counter with a cloth working the end-of-day wipe down in long, steady strokes. She looked up when the bell rang. She looked at Calla. She looked at the garbage bag. She did not speak for a moment, just looked in the way of perceptive people who are reading a situation and have too much respect for the person in front of them to narrate back what they see. Then she set the cloth on the counter and said, "Sit down, sugar. I'll make you some toast." Calla sat at the small table in the back of the bakery. Opal brought her 2 thick slices of sourdough with butter applied generously, while the bread was still warm enough to melt it, and a thin spread of sourwood honey on top and a tall glass of cold milk. Calla ate. She was hungry. She had not eaten since noon, and she ate with the focused attention of someone for whom food has always been fuel rather than ceremony. While she ate, Opal made phone calls from the phone near the register. Calla could hear her voice across the room, low and even, pausing to listen, asking a question, listening again. Not urgent, not distress. The voice of a woman who has dealt with difficult things long enough to know that difficult things are resolved one step at a time, and the first step is always the next immediate step. And the next immediate step right now was finding this girl a place to sleep. Calla finished the toast. She wrapped both hands around the glass of milk and looked at the grain jars on the shelf behind the counter. Wheat berries and rye and dried field corn, amber and gold and pale yellow in the lamplight, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she had been developing for years and had gotten reasonably proficient at. Opal came back and set her forearms on the counter and looked at Calla with the direct, uncomplicated attention that was the most characteristic thing about her. "There's a cot in this back room," she said. "You'll sleep there tonight." She said it the way you state the weather. Not a charitable offer that could be declined, but the next thing that was going to happen, stated for informational purposes. "And I have something else I want you to hear about, something that came to my attention a few months ago that I've been holding on to because I didn't know when it would be relevant." She paused, organizing the presentation. "It's relevant now." Calla waited. "I know of a property up in Madison County," Opal said, "past Hot Springs back in the mountains along Laurel Creek. It's an old grist mill, stone construction. 2 stories, been sitting empty since 1962. The county tried to have it demolished twice, and both times the contractor said it wasn't worth driving equipment up the creek trail, so it's still standing." She watched Calla's face. "It went up for tax sale last year. Nobody bid. The county's asking price is $10. Calla said nothing. "I'll tell you the problems first," Opal said, "because there are problems and you deserve to hear them straight. The roof has a section missing on the west side, rafters exposed. No electric within a quarter mile. No running water. No road past the Forest Service turnaround, which is 2 miles from the mill by trail. The water wheel is broken. Some of the floor may have rot." She paused. "The building is stone. The walls are 2 feet thick and straight. The foundation is bedrock, the actual creek bed. It has been standing in that valley for 150 years. She set both hands flat on the counter, the gesture Calla had learned to recognize as Opal's way of signaling that what came next was the part that actually mattered. "And nobody will bother you out there. Nobody will bother you." Those 4 words went into Calla, somewhere specific, and did not come back out. They landed in the place where the weight had been living, the weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing it had a particular shape or a particular cause. Nobody will bother you. She had spent 18 years being bothered in one form or another, watched, evaluated, made smaller by the accumulated pressure of someone else's decisions about what her presence in a room was worth. The idea of a place where the only sounds were water and wind and the weight of old stone, a place where nothing monitored her or assessed her or decided what she was worth more than $10. It was worth everything she had. "Yes," she said, "I want it." Opal drove the bakery van to the Madison County Courthouse the next morning. The van smelled like sourdough and diesel in a combination that Calla would associate for the rest of her life with this particular morning, with this particular turning point, with the feeling of moving towards something rather than away from it. They drove out of Asheville on I-26 and turned onto US 25 at Mars Hill and followed the French Broad River into the mountains, the road rising and the ridges closing in on both sides and the river visible below them through the trees as they climbed toward Marshall. Madison County is the kind of place that still looks in most of it the way the mountains of western North Carolina looked before anyone arrived to plan anything. The ridges run north to south, stacked behind each other in the particular way of the southern Appalachians, each ridge a slightly different shade of blue. In the morning haze, the valleys between them narrow and steep-sided and crossed by creeks that run fast enough over smooth stone to be heard from 50 yards away. The French Broad cuts through the main valley at Marshall, and the town of Marshall sits in the gap between the river and the hills with just enough room to function a main street, a courthouse, a handful of businesses that have been there long enough to stop being self-conscious about their own continued existence. The courthouse was 2 stories of solid brick construction, built to last and lasting, the kind of public building that expresses through its materials a commitment to the idea of public institutions that the current age has mostly stopped making. The clerk's office was on the 2nd floor at the end of a hallway with a linoleum floor and fluorescent lights and the smell of paper and old metal that all county courthouses share. Eleanor Briggs was the clerk. She was in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair, cut practically short, and reading glasses that she pushed up onto her head when she wasn't actively reading and brought down when she was. She had the directness of a woman who has been providing accurate information about difficult situations to people who sometimes didn't want to hear it for long enough to have concluded that directness is its own form of respect. She looked at the tax sale listing. She looked at Calla. She looked at Opal. She looked back at the listing. She pushed her glasses down. The old Whit Mill up on Laurel Creek. "That's the one," Opal said. Eleanor set the listing on the desk and folded her hands on top of it with the deliberateness of a woman who is about to be thorough and wants you to know she intends to be. "Young lady," she said, "that property is 2 miles from the nearest maintained road. The last mile of that 2 miles is a footpath packed, dirt root covered, generally passable in dry conditions, and a different proposition in rain or ice. There is no electric service to the structure or within a meaningful distance of it, no cell service along the trail at any point. The building has not been legally occupied since 1962. She adjusted her glasses. The county filed for demolition in 2008. The contractor assessed the situation and declined to mobilize equipment for the site. The county filed again in 2016. Same assessment, same outcome. She looked at Calla directly. "I want you to understand what you are proposing to purchase." Calla placed a $10 bill on the counter. She had counted it out from the Ziploc bag that morning, sitting on the edge of the cot in Opal's back room. She had $204 left after this, plus the silver dollar, which she did not count. Eleanor Briggs looked at the $10 bill. She picked up her pen. "Sign here," she said, "and here, and here." Opal drove her as far as the gravel Forest Service road went, which was to a turnaround beside a brown wooden trailhead sign with carved letters, Laurel Creek Trail. Below the name, a distance 2 miles. The gravel ended at a small cleared area, and then the forest simply continued, the trail disappearing into it between 2 rhododendron bushes, as if the mountain had opened just enough to let a person through. Opal stopped the van at the turnaround and got out. She pressed a brown paper bag into Calla's hands. Bread and hard cheese and 2 apples and a small jar of sourwood honey with a paper label in her own handwriting. She held Kala's shoulders and looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention that was the most characteristic thing about her. "You call me when you need something," she said. "Not if, when. There's a payphone at the gas station in Hot Springs, 8 miles south on 25. We'll figure out a time. You call me Tuesdays at 8. I'll be at the bakery phone and we can talk." She held Kala's shoulders a moment longer. "You have what you need." Then she got back in the van and drove away on the gravel road, the sourdough and diesel smell fading, and then the sound of the engine, and then there was nothing but Kala and the paper bag and the backpack and the garbage bag of her belongings and the opening in the rhododendron that was the start of the trail. She could hear the creek from where she stood. It was audible before she took the first step, a low, continuous sound from somewhere ahead and to the left, the sound of water moving with intention over stone, a sound like someone in another room having a conversation in a language you don't speak, but that sounds from the tone and rhythm of it like nothing particularly urgent is being said. She started walking. The trail was narrow, but clearly used, the earth packed hard by decades of feet, the feet of farmers and their children and their mules and their dogs, generations of the same families, walking the same 2 miles to the same place and back again until the path wore itself into the hillside, as naturally as a crease in well-worn cloth. It wound alongside the creek, rising gradually as the valley narrowed, crossing 2 small tributaries on flat stones that had been placed there by someone who had crossed them enough times to decide the placement was worth the effort. The forest in February was open. The deciduous trees had been bare since November, and the light came through the canopy in a way it never would in summer. Not the green, filtered underwater light of full leaf, but a pale winter silver, the sky showing through the branches in long, irregular panels, the mountains visible on both sides of the valley above the tree line. The rhododendrons kept their leaves through the winter and grew dense on the creek banks, their broad, dark leaves glossy, even in the February cold, forming tunnels along the trail in places that you passed through as if entering a different density of air. The creek ran to her left, 3 to 5 feet below the trail, on a bed of stones worn smooth by centuries of the same water making the same passage. She could see the bottom clearly in the shallow sections, each stone a slightly different color and size, but all of them rounded by time into the same general oval patience. The water was cold. You could see it in the color, a particular blue-gray that mountain water has in February, when the snow melt is still feeding it from above, and it moved fast enough that the surface showed white in the riffles, where the bed rose close to the surface. She walked for 45 minutes. She passed a waterfall, small and deliberate, the water dropping 6 feet over a ledge of dark rock into a pool so clear she could count the pebbles on the bottom, the largest ones the size of her fist, and the smallest ones indistinguishable from sand at the edges. She passed a stand of white birch, their paper bark peeling in long curls that would fall and become soil by summer. She passed what had once been a chimney, 4 feet of fitted stone, rising from the hillside, with nothing above them, the house it had served, gone entirely back to the forest, only this vertical remnant of it remaining. She had been alone many times in her life. She had been alone in Boyd's house, alone in rooms at school, alone in the particular way of a person who is physically present in a group but not part of it, which is one of the loneliest ways to be alone. But this was different from all of those. The forest didn't watch her. The creek didn't have an opinion about what she was worth. The mountains rising on both sides were not evaluating her or deciding anything about her. They existed with the complete indifference of things that don't require anything from you, and she existed inside them, and that was the entire nature of the arrangement, and it was enough. She came around the sharp bend where the creek curved around the granite outcropping, a block of stone the size of a house, gray and solid and ancient, the lichen on its face, centuries old and stopped. The mill sat directly ahead. It straddled the creek on the stone foundation Ezra Witt had built from the creek bed itself, the walls rising directly from the bedrock, the water flowing through the archway beneath. 2 stories of rough-cut stone, gray and dark green, with 150 years of lichen growth, the blocks fitted without mortar, each one chosen by a man who understood that stone talks to the person patient enough to listen. The lower story housed the grinding mechanism. The upper story, with its 2 windows on each side, was where Silas Witt had eaten and slept and read and been alive for 4 decades. On the creek side, the water wheel was still attached, though barely, 3 paddles missing the axle cracked through its center, the whole thing listing toward the water and covered in moss, thick enough to squeeze. The front door, heavy oak, darkened to almost black by weather, and time hung on iron hinges, gone orange with rust, rested at an angle against the stone frame. One hinge broken the door, unable to fully close. The roof on the west side was open. A section of shingles, perhaps 15 feet wide, was gone. The rafters exposed to the sky, weathered to silver gray, the interior of the upper floor visible from the trail. But the walls were straight. This was the first thing Calla registered, and it registered as clearly as if someone had said it aloud. The walls were straight, and the corners were plumb, and the foundation, which was the creek bed itself, was bedrock. The building had been standing for 150 years, and it could stand for 150 more if someone cared enough to give it a roof and attend to what needed attending. She pushed past the broken door and went inside. The lower mill room was exactly what it had been, a single large space, stone floor, heavy oak beams overhead, the grinding stones standing in the center, on their wooden frame covered in dust and cobwebs, and the particular stillness of a place that has been sealed away from time. The creek was audible everywhere, coming up through the stone floor and through the archway at the rear of the room, where the water flowed beneath the building. She felt it in the soles of her feet before she heard it with her ears. She tested the staircase step by step, pressing with one foot before committing weight, listening to what the wood said about itself. The steps flexed and complained, but they held. The second floor was a single room, wide chestnut plank floor dark with age, stone walls, a stone fireplace against the back wall with a chimney running up through the damaged roof section, an iron bed frame in one corner, a wooden table and a single chair against the far wall, dusty, but when she pressed on the table with both hands, it did not shift. She walked the floor slowly. Near the fireplace, within 8 feet of the hearth, she felt it, a slight give under her right foot, barely perceptible, the kind of signal that would be missed by anyone who wasn't paying, the kind of attention that she paid to everything, the attention that had been her survival mechanism for years, the reading of small signs before they became large ones, the noticing of subtle variations in what should be fixed and isn't. She stopped. She pressed again. Yes, the board under her foot rocked slightly at its near edge. She knelt, pressed her palm against the plank surface, felt the fractional lift. She slid her fingers into the gap at the edge and lifted. The plank came up easily, too easily. It was designed to come up. The boards in this section had been prepared, cut and relaid so they would lift as a unit without tools, a trapdoor built to look like flooring, the seams indistinguishable from the rest of the floor until you were on your knees looking for them. She lifted them one by one and set them aside. In the cavity below, nestled in the space between the floor, joist, and the ceiling of the mill room below, was a wooden crate, handmade, rough-sawn lumber, unfinished edges, rope handles, looped through drilled holes on each side. She reached down and took one handle and pulled, heavy, more than she expected. She got both hands under it and lifted it out and set it on the floor. Inside the crate, wrapped in heavy canvas that had been thoroughly coated in beeswax and neatly tied with cord, were mason jars. She counted them, 12, each one sealed with a zinc lid, each one full. The pale February light coming through the empty window frames fell across the jars in a way that caught the contents and held it the particular quality of light on old metal and old paper, dense and serious in a way that suggested permanence. She opened the first jar. Coins, large silver dollars and half-dollars stacked tight inside the glass, their surfaces worn smooth with the handling of decades, cool and heavy when she lifted one out. The date on the one she looked at most closely was 1934. She opened the second. Paper money, old bills rolled tight and packed in so densely the jar weighed several pounds. She unrolled one and smoothed it flat on the floor. A $20 bill, the paper stiff and brown-edged, the ink faded to a sepia quality but fully legible. Third jar coins, fourth bills, fifth a careful mixture of both, layered with the precision of someone who understood preservation and had thought about how the contents would need to survive whatever came next. She opened all 12 jars. She sat on the chestnut floor and she counted what she found. The paper money, when she had laid it all out in organized rows on the floor around her, totaled $19,400. The coins, she would learn several weeks later when she had them appraised at a shop in Asheville, were worth $12,800, mostly in silver content, the metal itself which holds its value in ways that paper doesn't because it doesn't require anyone's faith. $32,200. At the bottom of the wooden crate below the last jar was a leather pouch tied with a piece of twine. The leather was dark and dry but intact. The wax canvas had protected it completely. She untied the twine and opened the pouch and removed a single folded piece of paper, dry and slightly brittle at the fold lines, the paper the color of old cream. She unfolded it carefully, working the corners first until it lay flat in both her hands. The writing was in pencil. The letters were formed with the deliberate care of a man who was not accustomed to writing letters and wanted this particular letter to be readable for a long time. My name is Silas Witt. I have run this mill since 1921. My father ran it before me since 1904. My grandfather built it in 1871 with stones he cut from the creek bed with his own two hands. This money is what I have earned and saved over 41 years of milling corn and wheat and rye for the people of this valley. I put it here because banks are for people who trust paper more than they trust stone. I trust stone. If you are reading this, you have found my mill and you have found my savings. Use them to keep the mill standing. The stones are good. The creek is clean. The wheel can be fixed. A mill is a useful thing. A place that turns grain into flour is a place that feeds people. As long as it stands, someone will be fed. I am leaving this mill and I will not be coming back. I am old and the winter is long and I know the shape of a man's last winter when it arrives. I have one regret. I have a granddaughter I have never met. Her name is Edna. Her father was my son and we were not close in the years when we should have been, and then he was gone in the war, and I never found a way to reach her after that. If she ever comes here, she should know that the mill was built to last. Some things are built that way, built to outlast the people who made them, built to still be standing when someone who needs them finally arrives. This is not a sad letter. I had a good life. I ground grain for 41 years, and I fed people, and that is enough for any man. Silas Witt. April 1958. Calla read it once through without stopping. Then she read it again, slowly, staying with each sentence. She folded it carefully along the creases that had been there since 1958 and slid it back into the leather pouch. She held the pouch against her chest with both hands and sat on the chestnut floor of a building she had purchased for $10 in the mountains of Madison County, North Carolina, on a February afternoon when the light was going pale in the west and she felt something she did not have a single word for. Not happiness, though something adjacent to it was present. Not relief, though relief was part of the composition. Not gratitude, not wonder, not grief, though elements of all of these moved through her in the minutes she sat there. She felt found, not by a person and not by luck and not by any of the conventional mechanisms through which rescue is supposed to arrive, by a place, by this specific physical stone and water and chestnut fact of this place, which had been standing in this valley through every season for 150 years, holding money and holding a letter and standing over a cold mountain creek with its broken wheel and its missing window panes and its loose boards carefully arranged above a wooden crate, waiting without consciousness or intention for the arrival of whoever came next. She reached into her backpack, found the sock, took out the silver dollar worn smooth on both faces, the 1922 date, still legible, the silver warm from the sock and the sock warm from the pack. She turned it in her fingers. Loretta had pressed it into her palm 3 years ago in the kitchen of the Watauga County farmhouse and told her to keep it somewhere close and remember that somebody had worked hard and held on to something real and passed it forward. She put it back in the sock and the sock back in the backpack. She looked at the room around her, the iron bed frame, the table and the one chair, the fireplace with its deep stone hearth, the chestnut floor dark with a century and a half of use, the empty window frames through which she could see the forest canopy and the gray winter sky and the hemlock branches on the hillside across the creek. She was going to fix this place. She didn't have a full plan for how. She didn't need a full plan. She had the next step, and the next step was enough. Outside the creek ran beneath the building and out the other side and continued down the valley toward Hot Springs and the French Broad River, the same water it had always been, always passing through and always arriving, making the sound it had been making in this valley since before Ezra Witt arrived with his mule and his chisels and his ability to read stone. Calla Merritt sat on the chestnut floor of a mill that had been standing for 150 years, and for the first time in her life that she could locate and name, she did not feel small. She felt exactly the size she needed to be. She spent her first night in the mill on the iron bed frame with her sleeping bag unrolled across the rusted springs and her backpack on the floor beside her, and the leather pouch with Silas Witt's letter pressed against the side of the pack where she would feel it if she reached for it in the dark. The sound of the creek came up through 20 inches of fitted stone, steady and unchanging, the same note all through the night, and she lay awake for a long time, not from fear or worry, but from the unusual sensation of being in a place where nothing was required of her except to be there. She woke before light. This was habit 4:30, had been her hour for 2 years, and her body had adjusted to it the way bodies adjust to whatever routine they're given long enough. She lay still for a moment in the dark listening. The creek, a light wind somewhere above the canopy, the particular silence of a forest in February, at 5 in the morning, a silence so complete you could hear individual things inside it. She got up and found the anatomy textbook in the garbage bag of her belongings. She opened to the back cover. Verna's annotations had not reached the back, which made the inside of the back cover a clean page of cream-colored cardstock. She found a pencil in the front pocket of her backpack and wrote a list in small, careful letters in the margin. Roof first, then windows, then floor joists, then water, then power, then the wheel. She underlined the last item twice. The wheel was not simple, replacing 3 paddles and a cracked axle on a 12-foot wooden water wheel that had been motionless for 60 years was a month's project at minimum, and it depended on everything else being done first. But the wheel was the point. Without the wheel, the grinding stones were artifacts. With the wheel, they were tools. She wanted tools. She folded the back cover closed and walked the 2 miles out to the trailhead in the early light, climbed to the Forest Service road and waited at the edge of the gravel for a Forest Service truck she had seen parked at the trailhead the day before. It came at 7:30, and the ranger inside, a man in his 40s with a thermos of coffee and no particular curiosity about why a young woman with a backpack was standing at the edge of his gravel road, gave her a ride into Hot Springs. She called Opal from the payphone at the gas station. "I found something," she said when Opal answered. Opal was quiet for a moment. "Tell me." Calla told her everything. The loose floorboards, the wooden crate, the wax canvas, the 12 mason jars, the count of the money, the leather pouch, the letter. She described Silas Witt's handwriting and the care with which the letter was formed and the specific things Silas had written about the granddaughter he had never met, whose name was Edna. Opal was quiet for longer this time. Then she said, "Silas Witt, Lord." A pause. "My grandmother used to take her corn up that trail. She talked about him." Another pause. "She said he could grind a bushel so fine you could bake angel food cake with it." Calla told Opal she was going to deposit the money in Marshall and start buying materials. "Good," Opal said. "Start with the roof." "I know. And let's keep our Tuesday arrangement. You call me at 8, I'll be at the bakery. If I need to reach you, I'll leave word at the gas station and we'll sort out a time. All right?" She hitched into Marshall and deposited $32,200 in cash at the only bank on the main street, a transaction that required 2 tellers and a branch manager and 90 minutes of paperwork. She opened the account in her own name, Calla Merritt, 18 years old, owner of record for a property on Laurel Creek in Madison County, North Carolina. She did not know that Boyd Sutter was already in motion. Boyd found out about the bank deposit through the particular information network of small county life, which operates through proximity and shared memory rather than any formal channel. A teller had a sister who knew a woman who had been at the hardware store in Marshall on the day Calla was there, pricing roofing materials, and the fact of a young woman pricing roofing materials for a property up Laurel Creek reached Boyd within 48 hours through a chain of people who had no idea they were passing information to someone who intended to use it. He knew she had come into money. He knew it was connected to the $10 property. He drove to the Forest Service Road trailhead that afternoon and found a Forest Service ranger doing maintenance work on the trailhead sign. Eleanor Briggs called the gas station in Hot Springs 3 days later and left a message for Calla. When Calla called back from the payphone on Tuesday morning, Eleanor told her about Boyd's visit to the clerk's office, his claim about her age and contractual capacity, his intention to file a legal challenge. "I want you to know," Eleanor said with the clarity of a woman who has thought carefully about what she is going to say and has decided to say all of it, that you were 18 years and 3 months old when you signed that deed transfer and the sale is legally valid, and I told him this directly. I also want you to tell me if you need a copy of the signed documentation for your own records, because I will provide that today." A pause. He seemed less interested in the legal reality than in the property itself, specifically in what might be in or on it. Calla thanked her and called Opal. Opal listened without interruption until Calla had finished describing the call with Eleanor. Then she said, "I'm going to make a call." The call Opal made was to a woman named Harriet in the county assessor's office in Marshall, who had a memory for land records that bordered on the encyclopedic and a particular familiarity with geological surveys, because her late husband had been a licensed mining engineer, and she had spent 30 years listening to him describe what various geological formations indicated about what might lie beneath them. What Harriet found and relayed to Opal in a phone call that Opal then condensed and delivered to Calla at the Tuesday payphone the following week was this: Consolidated Ridge Resources, a mineral extraction company with offices in Asheville, backed by larger capital from Charlotte, had commissioned a 30-mile geological survey corridor running through the ridge system of Madison County approximately 18 months earlier. The survey, which was a matter of public record, though not one recently consulted, had identified several properties in the Laurel Creek watershed as containing elevated concentrations of certain mineral deposits of commercial interest. One of those properties was the Whitmill parcel. The survey results had been shared through an informal channel that was technically permissible but not standard practice, with several private landowners and individuals with documented interest in properties within the survey corridor. One of the names listed in the distribution records as having received informal access to the survey findings was Boyd Sutter of Asheville, North Carolina. The survey results had been shared with Boyd approximately 8 months before he changed the locks on the front door. Calla stood at the Hot Springs payphone with this information and held the receiver against her ear and said nothing for a moment. Boyd Sutter had not locked her out in anger. He had not locked her out in a moment of bourbon-fueled decision-making or the particular cruelty of a man whose patience had run out. He had locked her out as part of a plan constructed around information he had received before she turned 18, a plan that required her name off the Merritt household records and off any claim to property in the area before he could move forward with what Consolidated Ridge wanted from the land. He had known about the geological survey for 8 months. He had been arranging the pieces of this for 8 months, and if she had not walked into Eleanor Briggs's office and put $10 on a counter, he would eventually have found some way through Verna, through some legal instrument presented as a formality, through the patient application of the kind of coldness he had been practicing for years, to place himself in a position to deal with the mineral rights. She was not surprised. She was tired and she was clear-eyed, and she was standing at a payphone 8 miles from a 2-mile trail that led to a mill she owned, and what she felt was not surprise, but something closer to the particular feeling you have when a shape that was always there in the dark finally becomes visible enough to see, and you understand that the dark was protecting you from nothing, only from knowing what was already present. She called Opal back at 8 the following Tuesday. "What do I do?" she asked. "You fix the roof," Opal said, "and then the windows, and then you get the mill running. A building in active use with a documented historical claim and a county clerk who respects you is a different legal situation than a crumbling structure on a tax roll. You build the reality that you want, and then you defend the reality you've built." A pause. "And find someone to read those land documents carefully. Everything in that crate." Calla went back to the mill and wrote a longer list in the back cover of the anatomy textbook. Then she went to the building supply in Marshall and bought roofing materials and arranged for delivery to the trailhead and began carrying them in. Not all at once. She made 2 trips a day for the first week, sometimes 3, each one a 2-mile walk uphill along the creek with 40 to 50 pounds on the frame pack she bought at the Hot Springs thrift store for $7. She was small, but she had discovered over the preceding weeks that small and strong were not the same variable. She was strong in the specific way that people who have been physically capable and careful with their bodies become strong over time, efficiently without waste. Every system working in coordination with every other system, the whole arranged toward a single purpose. She was also stubborn. She had been stubborn her entire life, but in Boyd's house, she had always expressed it in ways that didn't show. Out here, there was no one to hide it from. The first month was the roof. She tore off the damaged shingles on the west side. Some came off in sections, others crumbled at the touch. The wood beneath them gray and punky with decades of exposure. She replaced 2 rafters that had given way entirely, cutting new 2x10s on the sawhorse she built from salvaged lumber in the mill room and fitting each piece with a handsaw because she didn't have a circular saw, and wouldn't have until the second month. She laid roofing felt from rolls she carried up the trail on her back, stapling it flat, cutting each section to the overlap required before she began the shingles. The first row of shingles was crooked. She pulled it and started again. The second row was better, but still not right at the east end. She pulled it and started again. The third row she did slowly, using a chalk line she had borrowed from a hardware store in Marshall with the deposit from the remaining dollars in her Ziploc bag. It came out right. By the 10th row, she didn't need the chalk line anymore. She had found the rhythm nail slide, overlap, nail slide, overlap, the pattern entering her hands before it was fully organized in her mind, the way physical knowledge establishes itself below the level of deliberate thought through the patient repetition of correct action. When the last shingle was down and she climbed off the roof and stood on the bank of the creek below the west wall and looked up at an unbroken roof line, no gap, no exposed wood, the new pale shingles contrasting with the weathered originals, but the whole surface sound. She sat down on a flat creek stone and ate a sandwich she had made that morning from bread she'd brought from Grain and Honey on her last supply run, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She had built a roof. Not a perfect roof, not a professionally finished roof, but a roof that would keep rain out and warmth in, and that she had laid with her own hands one row at a time over 9 days of work. Nobody could lock that in a room or put it in a garbage bag on a porch. It was hers, nailed into the rafters of a stone building that had been standing in this valley for 150 years, permanent. The second month was windows. She measured each of the 8 openings and wrote the dimensions in the back of the anatomy textbook and drove to a glass supplier in Asheville and ordered the panes cut to size. She transported them back in the bed of a borrowed truck, a 1994 Ford F-150 with a cracked windshield that belonged to a man at the building supply who rented it by the day, wrapped each pane in moving blankets, and carried them down the trail one at a time, cradled flat against her chest, her arms taking the full horizontal weight, the way you carry something that will shatter if you let it tilt. She glazed them herself, pressing putty into the old stone frames with her thumb, working it in increments around the perimeter, fitting each pane until it sat plumb and true and still. When the last window was in and she stood in the upstairs room and looked out through clean glass at the forest canopy and the creek below, the room filled with light differently than it had before, not the pale, flat light of winter through open gaps, but something coherent and whole, the hemlock green and the creek gray and the sky white-blue all present, at once held inside the room suddenly complete in a way it hadn't been when it was open to the weather. It looked for the first time since she'd owned it like somewhere a person was meant to be. It was during the second month that Gus Fenwick first appeared. He came on a Wednesday morning in March, which Calla noted because most people she encountered in the mountains seemed to operate on a schedule that was loosely connected to the standard week, but not strictly bound by it. He was 63 or 64 years old, with a face that had been outside for every one of those years and showed it weathered to the color and texture of a piece of well-used leather, and he moved with the particular economy of motion of someone who has done physical work for decades and has long since eliminated every unnecessary movement from his repertoire. He grew heirloom corn on 40 acres in the lower valley varieties he had been saving seed from for 20 years, which meant his corn had corn that had corn behind it, going back to before his grandfather's time. He had heard about the mill from Eleanor Briggs, who had heard about it from the Forest Service ranger, who had given Calla her first ride into Hot Springs, which was the mechanism through which news traveled in this part of Madison County, through the accumulated knowledge of people who paid attention to what was happening in their territory. He walked up the trail with a 50-pound sack of dried heirloom field corn on one shoulder and a pocket knife in his front pocket that he used for everything from cutting baling twine to eating an apple. He set the sack inside the mill room door and looked at the grinding stones for what seemed like 2 full minutes without speaking. Then he said, "These the same stones Silas ran." "Far as I know," Calla said. He nodded once slowly. He looked at the wheel through the rear archway, still broken, still listing the moss on it patient and thick. "That wheel fixable?" "Yes," Calla said. She had looked at it closely enough by now to know the answer. He nodded again. He picked up the corn sack and set it in the corner with the care of someone who is putting something in the right place rather than simply setting it down. "I'll bring more when you're ready," he said. "My grandfather used to carry his corn up this trail every October." He talked about Silas Witt the way some people talk about doctors, like the man did something essential that nobody else could do the same way. He turned to go, then stopped. She said he could feel when the stones needed dressing just by the sound of the grinding, said he could hear it in the flour. He left. He came back the following week with another 50 pounds, and the week after that, and every week through the spring and into summer, building a small inventory in the corner of the mill room against the day when the wheel would turn and the stones would grind again. Walt Red arrived on a Thursday in the 3rd week of March. He was 89 years old, a fact that registered differently when you saw him than it did when you heard it, because the number suggested fragility that was not visible. He was slow, as very old men are slow, but he moved with a precision that had nothing fragile about it. He had served in Korea in the early 1950s, had come home when he was 20, and had spent the following 6 decades doing the kinds of things that men in the mountains did: farming, logging, running a small sawmill operation. For a decade, the slow accumulation of competence across a range of physical skills that the current era has mostly stopped teaching because it has mostly stopped needing. He had arms that were still capable, and hands that knew machines, and an eye for mechanical systems that had not diminished with age. He knew about Consolidated Ridge from the same network that had brought Gus Fenwick to the mill. He had heard about the survey trucks from a neighbor who had spoken to a county commissioner who had mentioned the company by name at a public meeting. Walt had attended that meeting, as he attended most public meetings, because at 89 years old in a county you had lived in your entire life. Public meetings are one of the few remaining mechanisms through which the land you live on gets to be shaped by the people who live on it. And Walt Red had spent enough of his life in situations where that mechanism was unavailable to appreciate it when it was. He appeared at the trailhead on a Thursday morning carrying a canvas bag over his shoulder that contained a hand plane, 3 chisels of graduated sizes, a half pint of linseed oil, and a small whetstone. He came in without introducing himself, looked at the grinding stone mechanism for several minutes, set his bag down, and began examining the wooden gear assembly against the wall, the component that would connect the wheel's axle to the grinding stone's vertical shaft. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. He never called ahead, never announced his intentions, never asked for or offered any explanation of why an 89-year-old man was walking 2 miles of mountain trail every week to work on the mechanical restoration of a mill. He simply came and worked and went home before dark. Calla understood this without needing it explained. She had in her own way been doing something similar for years, arriving at the places where she was needed and doing the work that was in front of her without making a production of either the arrival or the work. The 3rd month was the floor and the fireplace. She pulled the loose planks near the fireplace, the ones she had already lifted, to find the crate, and checked every joist with a screwdriver and her palm, probing for softness, listening to what the wood said when she tapped it. 2 joists had lost their structural integrity to moisture and time. She pulled them out carefully, not wanting to disturb the surrounding floor structure, and fitted new 2x10s in their places, shimming until the level said true. Then she relaid the original chestnut planks and began sanding. She sanded by hand, not because she didn't eventually acquire a power sander she did in the second week of the month, but because she started by hand, and what happened in that first week of hand sanding taught her something that no tool could have taught. The chestnut planks had been adze hewn in 1871. The marks of the adze were in the wood shallow ridges running parallel to the grain, the record of the man who had shaped these boards. Under the layers of use and darkened oil that had built up over 150 years, those marks were still there. Sanding with a block and paper, she could feel them. She learned to sand with the grain and not against it, learned how much pressure to apply before the paper began to cut rather than abrade, learned to read the surface by touch and adjust what she was doing accordingly. When the original chestnut appeared warm and golden brown, the grain rippled with the adze marks, the color and the wood smell of something very old and very sound coming up through the patina of decades. She understood something she hadn't before about what the word restoration actually meant. It didn't mean creating something new. It meant removing what time had laid on top of something that had always been there. The fireplace she cleaned by hand, a wire brush she built from materials she found in the mill room, taped to successive lengths of dowel rod that she added as she worked up the chimney, pushing the brush from below, working in sections, pulling it down black with 60 years of creosote deposits and pushing it back up. The work took a full day and left her covered in black from the waist up and breathing through a cloth she had wrapped around her face. When she thought she had gone high enough, she built a small fire of dry twigs in the hearth and watched the smoke. It went straight up, clean and direct, no hesitation, no backpuffing into the room. The chimney was clear. She pressed her palm against the warm stone beside the firebox and felt the heat moving through it, and thought about the number of times Silas Witt had pressed his palm against the same stone to check the draft on a winter morning. How many mornings that was. 41 years of mornings, which was approximately 15,000 days, which was approximately 15,000 times pressing his palm against this stone on the way from the bed to the stove. She understood him better than she had when she first read his letter. She understood what it meant to make a place yours, not through ownership in any legal or formal sense, but through the accumulated weight of daily presence, through the 10,000 repetitions of the same gesture in the same space that create a relationship between a person and a place so thorough that it becomes difficult to say which one is holding the other. The fourth month was water and power. For water, she ran a copper pipe from the hand pump at the kitchen counter. She built against the north wall of the upstairs room a simple assembly of salvaged lumber and 2 reclaimed cabinet doors she found at a shop in Marshall, down through the floor and through the mill room and through the stone archway and into the creek at a depth of 3 feet where the water ran cleanest, the intake protected by a screen she fashioned from copper mesh. Cold, clean mountain water pulled up by the pump handle with 30 strokes of preparation and then flowing immediately on demand. She washed her face under it the first morning the pump worked and stood with both hands in the stream and felt the cold running over her wrists and the uncomplicated satisfaction of water that came because you made it come. For power, she bought a 40-watt solar panel and mounted it on a bracket on the south-facing wall above the roofline, running the cable down through a hole she drilled in the stone with a rented hammer drill and a carbide bit. The battery she kept in the mill room below, a deep cycle marine battery that held enough charge to run an LED lamp, a phone charger, and the small radio she found at the thrift shop in Hot Springs for $3. The radio was old enough to have a physical dial and received 2 stations clearly and 1 intermittently. The clearest one was a public radio affiliate out of Asheville that played classical music in the evening's news, in the mornings, and on Sunday afternoons, old recordings of chamber music that filled the upstairs room with something Calla had not had in her life since Loretta's farmhouse. Sound that was purely for the pleasure of it, sound that asked nothing. She cleaned the grinding stones in the 4th month. She oiled the wooden frame. She left them where they were, the center of the mill room, the center of the whole building's purpose. 2 circles of granite, each one quarried and shaped by Ezra Witt's hands 150 years ago, fitted against each other with such precision that when they eventually turned again, they would produce flour as fine as anything a modern roller mill could make, because the principle of stone grinding does not improve with modernity. The principle of stone grinding is as old as grain itself. The wheel took 3 weeks. She replaced the 3 missing paddles with new ones she cut from white oak, a fallen tree, on the hillside above the mill that had been down long enough to have dried partially, the wood still dense and tight and resistant to her draw knife in a way that told her it was sound. She shaped each paddle by hand, working the draw knife along the grain, the shavings curling off in thin ribbons, the paddle emerging from the stock, the way shapes emerge from stone by removing what isn't needed until what is needed is what remains. She replaced the cracked axle with a piece of locust, straight-grained, clear of knots, heavy enough to carry the wheel's load without flex. She turned it round, and true, on a makeshift lathe she rigged from the truck's spare tire as the drive wheel and a corded drill as the motor, the setup, improvised from first principles and working because the physics required only that the stock rotate against the cutting tool, not that the cutting tool be held by anything elaborate. She rehung the wheel on its iron brackets, cleaned and oiled and solid after a full day of wire brushwork, and reconnected it to the gear assembly Walt Red had spent 3 months rebuilding, fitting the wooden drive shaft through the hole in the stone wall and engaging the main gear with the precise alignment that Walt's measurements, made with a plumb bob in a straight edge, had established. On a morning in late May, 5 months after she had walked down the trail with a backpack and a borrowed paper bag and everything she needed carried on her back, Calla stood at the sluice gate. The gate was a simple system, a wooden panel set in iron guides in the wall of the mill race lifted by a handled rod, opening the channel between the diversion dam and the wheel. She had tested the gate's operation 2 days earlier to confirm it would move. She had oiled the guides and the handle mount. She had walked every inch of the mill race to clear the debris of 6 decades' leaves and branches and the slow accumulation of silt until the channel ran clean and straight from the diversion point to the wheel. Edna Morse stood in the mill room near the grinding stone frame. She had come on Tuesday as she always came, but this Tuesday she had arrived with empty hands, no honey, no preserves, nothing, which was unusual enough that Calla had noticed. When she arrived, she had said simply, "I heard you might be ready today," which meant the valley had a way of knowing things that Calla had not yet fully mapped. Gus Fenwick stood against the exterior wall of the mill facing the creek, his arms folded and his pocket knife open in his right hand. He turned the blade in his fingers slowly, not thinking about it, just turning it. Walt Red was positioned just inside the mill room doorway, where he could see both the wheel through the rear archway and the gear assembly through the wall opening, because Walt had spent 3 months on that gear assembly, and he intended to watch it work from the beginning. Calla put her hands on the sluice gate handle. The wood was cold and slightly rough under her palms. She had been standing at this gate in her mind for 5 months, working toward this moment through every decision she had made about rafters and panes and copper fittings and axle wood. She pulled the handle. The gate rose in its guides. The water that had been held by the diversion dam diverted from the main creek flow and collected in the small pool above, dropped into the mill race channel with a sound like something being released after long holding and moved. It moved fast and straight down the channel toward the wheel. She heard it before she saw anything change. A low, rushing building, the water committed now to its direction. Then it hit the first paddle. The wheel moved, barely, a fraction of an inch, as if it had forgotten what movement felt like and needed a moment to remember. Then the water hit the second paddle, and the third, and the accumulated weight and pressure of the falling water on the descending arc of the wheel overcame the wheel's 60 years of motionlessness, and the wheel began to turn. Slowly at first, the moss on the old paddles dripping as they came over the top, the new white oak paddles bright in the morning light. The axle turned in the brackets. Inside the mill room, the drive shaft engaged the main gear, and then the grinding stones began to move. The sound was unlike anything she had imagined when she had imagined this moment, which she had imagined many times in the preceding months. It was not a grinding sound in the industrial sense. It was deeper than that, a low, heavy, rhythmic rumbling that she felt in the stone floor through the soles of her feet before her ears fully registered it, a sound that seemed to come from below, everything from the place where the building's foundations met the bedrock of the creek bed. The upper stone turned against the lower granite on granite, and the sound of it moved through the stone walls of the mill room and out through the windows and down the valley in the direction of the farms and the road. She stood in the doorway and watched the wheel turn. It turned, and the water fell off the paddles in sheets, and the gear assembly ran true and steady, and the stones turned, and the sound continued deep and patient and absolutely inevitable, the sound of a thing that had always been meant to turn turning again after too long still. Gus Fenwick unfolded his arms. He turned the pocket knife between his fingers one last time and then folded it and put it in his pocket. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. Walt Red stood at the doorway of the mill room and looked at the wheel and looked at the gearing and looked at the drive shaft and stood there for a full minute, watching everything work the way he had spent 3 months making it able to work. And then he went back inside without speaking, which was how Walt Red expressed that something had met his standards. Edna Morse walked slowly to the center of the mill room. She walked the way she always walked, deliberately, each step considered. She walked past the door, past the point where the gear assembly ran up the wall, past the wooden frame. She walked to the upper grinding stone, and she placed both hands flat against it. The stone turned beneath her palms, impossibly slow, enormously heavy, warm from the friction of granite against granite. She closed her eyes. She stood there with her palms on the turning stone, and the sound of the grinding moved through her hands and up through her arms, and her face went still, in the particular way that faces go still when something is happening inside that is too complete for any expression to contain. A tear moved down her cheek, slowly the way tears move on very old faces, finding the terrain that time has made following the particular path of this particular woman's particular years. It reached her jaw and fell and was gone. What is it worth to finally hear a sound that someone you loved described to you all your life? Edna stood with her eyes closed for 3 minutes, perhaps 4. The stones kept turning. The wheel kept turning outside. The creek kept flowing beneath everything. No one spoke. Even the birds on the hillside above the mill seemed to have paused. Then she opened her eyes. She looked at her palms still flat against the turning stone. She looked at the gear assembly on the wall. She looked through the rear archway at the wheel still turning in the morning light, each paddle coming over and catching the sun for a moment before dropping back into the water. She looked at Calla. My father used to write about this sound in his letters to my mother, she said. Her voice was steady and clear, the voice of someone who has decided that the things worth saying are worth saying plainly and completely. She used to read them to me when I was small. He wrote about it from the Pacific in 1944, a few months before he was killed. He said you could hear it from 2 miles down the valley on a still morning. He said it meant things were working the way they should. Calla waited. He left when he was young, Edna continued. He and his father, my grandfather, had a falling out that neither of them found a way to repair. The way men do sometimes when two people are alike enough that they can't see around each other, when pride is the same shape in both of them, and they stand across from each other and neither one can figure out how to step to the side. She looked at her hands on the stone again. He went to Knoxville. He married my mother. He enlisted in 1943 and went to the Pacific, and he did not come back. He was 26 years old. I was 3. I have no memory of him. Only what my mother told me and what he wrote in his letters and the sound she read to me that he described. She paused. The stones kept their slow turning. The creak sound came up through the floor. This sound, Edna said. This exact sound. Calla thought about the letter in her backpack, the letter in the leather pouch written in April of 1958. I have a granddaughter I have never met. Her name is Edna. Silas Witt wrote about you, Calla said quietly. Edna looked at her. In the letter with the money, he wrote that he had a granddaughter he had never met, that her name was Edna, that her father was his son. Calla paused. He said he had tried to find her. The old woman was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the stone beneath her hands. She looked at the wheel through the archway. She looked at the morning light on the creek surface, broken and moving. I know, she said. I found that out 3 years ago. A county records clerk was doing a genealogical survey and matched the names, my father's name, my grandfather's name, the property records. She told me. Edna paused. I drove up here that day and walked the trail and stood at the bend and saw the building, and then I turned around and walked back out. Calla didn't ask the question. She waited. Because it wasn't ready, Edna said, and neither was I. She took her hands off the stone. She straightened in the unhurried way of a woman who has been straightening up from things for 84 years and has made her peace with the time it takes. But you came along, and you bought it for $10, and you fixed the roof and the windows and the floor, and you rebuilt the wheel. She looked at Calla directly. Now it's ready. The grinding stones turned. The water fell on the paddles outside. The sound continued moving through the stone walls and out through the open windows and down the valley where it had not traveled in 60 years. Summer came to Laurel Creek Valley, the way summer always comes to these mountain places, from the bottom up the creek, warming first, then the lower banks where the rhododendron put out its annual extravagance of pink and white flowers hanging over the water in clusters so dense you could smell them from 50 yards away, then the forest canopy closing overhead in successive layers of green. As the weeks advanced from April into June, the light changed as the canopy thickened, going from the open silver pale of early spring to the deep green filtered quality of full summer, the light coming through the hemlock and poplar in long slanted columns that moved slowly across the mill room floor as the day turned. Calla had been living in Whit Mill for 4 months when she found the second thing hidden in the walls. She was cleaning the lower mill room on a morning in late June, a project she had been approaching gradually since the restoration of the upper story was substantially complete, working from the door inward, through the ground floor, cleaning and cataloging, and arranging the old mechanical components she found stored in the space. There were implements she hadn't recognized when she first arrived that she could now identify: the 2-handled mill picks for dressing, the grinding surface, the flat iron hoop for gauging stone height, the wooden bushel measure that Silas had used to measure grain received and flour returned. She was working near the rear wall, the wall that faced the creek, through which the rear archway opened and through which the drive shaft connected the wheel's rotation to the interior gear system, when she noticed the stonework behind the grinding stone frame. The surrounding walls had the consistent lichen growth of old stonework, gray-green, continuous, penetrating the gaps between stones and growing from every surface in a pattern that spoke of decades of undisturbed establishment. But on a section of the rear wall, approximately 3 feet wide and 4 feet high, positioned directly behind and partially obscured by the lower grinding stone's wooden frame, the growth pattern was subtly different. The lichen covered the face of the stones, but had not penetrated the gaps between them, because the gaps were not gaps. They were seam lines cut into the face of what was actually a single piece of stone scored to create the appearance of fitted masonry. Calla stood very still for a moment looking at it. She pressed her palm against the surface. It moved, a fraction of an inch, not much, but enough. She worked a pry bar into the bottom edge, carefully not wanting to damage the surrounding stonework, and applied steady, even pressure. The panel tilted forward in its recess. She caught the top with her other hand and guided it out slowly, walking it clear of the opening in increments until it was free. She set it against the adjacent wall. It was heavy, solid granite, perhaps 3 inches thick, perhaps 70 pounds. Behind it was a cavity cut into the bedrock, 2 feet deep, 2 feet wide, 4 feet tall. The air inside was cool and dry, with the particular dryness of undisturbed stone, the kind of dryness that has nothing to do with weather or season, but is simply the natural state of enclosed rock. Inside the cavity was a tin box, larger than she expected, the size of a small suitcase, dark with age but not corroded. The sealed cavity had protected it from the humidity variations that cause metal to sweat and rust. A simple hinged lid with a latch closure. She lifted it, heavy. She carried it to the center of the mill room and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with dried twine, was a bundle of documents. She unwrapped them on the stone floor, working the knot loose rather than cutting it, smoothing the oilcloth aside and arranging the documents in the bar of light from the south window. She began with the top document, which was the oldest, heavy paper, the kind used for legal instruments in the late 19th century, thick and textured, the edges tanned, the printing and handwriting both legible despite the age. Homestead Patent, the United States of America, 1871. Ezra Witt, a legal description of the parcel beginning at the confluence of Laurel Creek and a smaller tributary to the north, running by Metis and bounds through the surrounding terrain in the specific surveying language of the period. She read the entire document. She read the section at the bottom twice slowly because the language was dense and she wanted to be certain she understood what it said. The patent granted to Ezra Witt and his heirs in perpetuity not only the surface rights to the described parcel, but the subsurface rights, the mineral rights under the full extent of the parcel described. These rights had not been severed from the surface title. They had not been transferred to any county, state, or private party. They had not lapsed or expired or been extinguished through any legal mechanism available in the record. They were as of this moment in the legal possession of the current surface title holder. They were hers. Consolidated Ridge Resources had been parking their survey truck at the trailhead in the dark. They had approached Boyd Sutter 8 months before he changed the locks on the basis of a geological survey, telling them that something of value lay beneath the land covered by this patent. Their entire strategy had been built on the assumption that the mineral rights could be purchased separately from the surface rights, which was common in properties where severance had occurred over time. But no severance had occurred here. Ezra Witt had retained the subsurface rights when he filed the patent in 1871, and they had stayed with the land through Harlan and Silas and the 60 years of the mill's silence and the $10 tax sale. Consolidated Ridge could not buy what she had not agreed to sell. She sat with the patent document on the stone floor of the mill room and listened to the wheel turning outside and the creek running beneath her and the summer birds on the hillside, and she understood the full shape of what Boyd had been trying to do. She found the second letter near the bottom of the tin box, its own leather pouch, smaller than the first one, the leather darker with age. She untied the pouch and removed a single folded page, stiffer than the 1958 letter, more fragile at the fold lines. October 1961. If you found the first letter and the money, then you know who I am. This is the other thing I left. Enclosed with this is the original homestead patent from 1871. My grandfather Ezra filed it himself when he built this mill. It covers everything the surface and everything below it. I never sold the below ground rights because nobody ever wanted them, and it never occurred to me that they would. If somebody wants them now, they cannot have them without your permission. Do not give your permission easily. The creek looks small. What is below it does not. I want to say something about my son. His name was Franklin. He was born in 1917, and he left in 1938, and I was too proud to ask him to come back, and he was too much like me to come back without being asked. He died in the Pacific in 1944. He was 26 years old, and I had not spoken to him in 6 years, and I have thought about that every day since the letter came. He had a daughter. Her name is Edna. I do not know where she is. I have tried 3 times to find her, and 3 times the trail has gone cold. If she ever comes here, tell her that her grandfather was a stubborn man who made a mistake he could not undo, and who was sorry for it in the way that sorry does not help anything, but is still the truest thing he had left. Tell her the mill was built to last, the same way some people are built to last, even when the people who made them were not. Silas Witt, October 1961. Calla sat with this letter for a long time. She sat with the sound of the wheel turning outside, and the summer heat pressing down through the stone walls, and the light moving across the mill room floor. She thought about Franklin Witt at 26 years old in the Pacific, writing to his wife about the sound of the grinding stones in the morning. She thought about Edna Morse, standing in this room a few weeks earlier with her hands on the turning stone and her eyes closed and a tear moving down her cheek. She thought about Silas writing 3 times to find a granddaughter and failing 3 times, and writing it down in October of 1961 because he needed someone to know he had tried. She put both letters back in their respective pouches. Both pouches went into the inside pocket of her backpack next to the silver dollar in the sock. She took the 1871 homestead patent separately and put it in the zippered compartment of the backpack. That document needed to be seen by someone who could read it properly. She thought of Opal's network of capable people and decided she would ask on Tuesday. Winter arrived in the first week of December with the abruptness of a mountain winter, not gradually, not with the gradual dimming of autumn, but with a first snow on a Friday that put 8 inches on the ground by Saturday morning and did not fully melt before the second snow came the following week. The creek slowed. The surface froze at the edges each night, thin ice forming and cracking and reforming, the pattern of it changing overnight. The hemlock branches bent under the weight of successive snowfalls and released it in small avalanches when the wind shifted. Calla had prepared for winter through October and November. With the same thoroughness she had brought to every other element of the mill's restoration. 4 cords of oak and hickory split and stacked under a tarp against the south wall. 8 weeks of preserved and dried food carried in on her back, in addition to the regular supply runs. The gaps around the window frames chinked with a mixture of hemp fiber and oil putty she had learned about from a restoration guide at the county library. The pipes insulated with foam tape she had found at the building supply. The stone walls performed exactly as their history suggested they would. 2 feet of fitted granite absorbed and released heat, slowly lagging behind the temperature outside by hours, which meant the internal temperature of the mill stayed stable cold on the coldest days, but not as cold as outside, and holding that cold for hours after the outside warmed rather than immediately adjusting. The wood stove kept the upstairs room warm enough to sleep in, even on nights when the temperature outside dropped to single digits, provided she banked the fire properly before bed. She learned to bank. It took 2 weeks to learn correctly the right combination of fuel density and airflow, the damper position that let the fire breathe without burning through too fast. By mid-December, she had it right-load the stove with the densest available wood at 9 at night, set the damper to a quarter open wake at 5 to find coals still hot enough to catch new wood within 3 minutes of opening the damper. On a Monday morning in the 3rd week of December, she heard footsteps on the trail. She was upstairs at the wood stove making coffee on the camp burner she still used for morning speed, the more efficient wood stove method for coffee requiring a longer preparation. She hadn't needed to master yet, and she heard the footsteps through the south window and looked out. The footsteps were slow, lighter than Gus, nothing like Walt, a cadence she didn't recognize at first and then did. She went downstairs. She stood in the mill room doorway as Verna Merritt came up the last section of trail toward the building. Her mother was wearing the gray wool coat she wore to church, not the barn jacket she owned for outdoor work, not a practical choice for this trail on a December morning, but the coat she associated with being somewhere that required presentability. She was carrying a single canvas shopping bag, the handles short, clearly not enough for a stay of any length. Her shoes were not right for the trail, and her face was pale in the winter light, and her eyes, when she looked up and saw Calla in the doorway, were difficult to read. They looked at each other across the flat stone that served as the mill's front step. Verna said, "I didn't know where else to go." She did not say, "I'm sorry." She did not say, "I should have done something when you were on the porch." She did not offer an explanation for the 10 months that had passed since a locked door and a garbage bag in February. She said the one sentence, "I didn't know where else to go," and waited with the stillness of someone who has arrived after a long journey and does not know what reception to expect and is not going to pretend otherwise. Is there someone in your life you would let back in, not because they deserved it, but because you still had room? Calla stood in the doorway of the mill she had built out of $10 and $32,000 of another man's savings and 5 months of carrying materials on her back through a mountain forest. She stood in the doorway of her own place, the first place in her life that was hers, and she looked at her mother standing on the flat stone with a shopping bag and the wrong shoes and no explanation that was going to resolve anything fundamental. She stepped to the side. "Coffee's on the stove," she said. Verna came in. She set the canvas bag down inside the door with the care of someone who is placing something in the only available position and knows it. She stood in the mill room for a moment, taking it in the grinding stones, the gear assembly on the wall, the new paddles on the wheel, visible through the rear archway, the floor swept clean. Then she looked at the staircase and Calla nodded toward it, and Verna climbed it slowly, one hand on the rail, and emerged into the upstairs room. She stood still for a long moment, the chestnut floor warm and golden in the lamplight, the wood stove ticking in the corner, the stone fireplace swept clean, a small fire burning, the bookshelves along the east wall, the anatomy textbook on the second shelf with its marked-up margins, the 8 windows looking out into the winter forest, the hemlock branches dark and snow-laden, the creek surface visible between them. She sat down in the chair at the table. Calla poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her mother. She sat on the edge of the bed, the locust frame bed she had built herself in the 2nd month with chestnut planks for the platform, and they drank their coffee in silence while the wood stove ticked and the snow outside the windows continued the business of the winter day. They did not talk about Boyd. They would not talk about Boyd for a long time, and when they finally did, it would be in increments, small pieces at a time, the way you approach something hot, not directly, not all at once, but by degrees. There are things between a mother and a daughter that do not reduce to conversation that live in a different register, accessible not through language, but through the accumulation of ordinary shared time. Verna stayed. She learned the pump, the number of strokes before the suction established, the way the water came cold, and immediate after that, the particular quality of Mountain Creek water that made everything you tasted made with it slightly better than the same thing made with city water. She learned the wood stove, the sequence of loading and venting, the way you judge the temperature by the color of the coals rather than any gauge. She learned the trail in all its February conditions, icy, in the shaded sections mud, in the sun-exposed ones, the particular placement of her feet that kept her upright in the worst parts. She learned to split kindling. She was bad at it for the first 2 weeks, the maul landing off-center, the piece skating off the splitting block, the whole exercise producing frustration in direct proportion to the effort. Then one morning Calla stood beside her and said nothing, but adjusted the position of her feet before Verna swung, and something clicked into place, and the piece split clean, and Verna understood where the technique lived. After that, she split kindling every morning before the stove needed feeding, producing a neat pile of fine pieces that she arranged against the south wall of the woodshed with a precision that was recognizably the same precision she had applied to the annotations in the veterinary anatomy textbook. Careful, thorough, the marks of someone who, given the right circumstances, did everything correctly. They did not say much. They worked side by side in the mornings and ate together in the evenings, and the shape of the days became something that held them both, which was not the same as everything being resolved, but was not nothing either. It was a beginning that was willing to be a beginning without pretending to be more. In late January, Opal drove to the trailhead and hiked in. She was wearing boots this time and carrying a bag on each shoulder, one with food supplies, the other with a folder of papers tucked under her arm, alongside a jar of good honey and a loaf of the rye bread that was Grain and Honey's signature and that Calla had been missing since December. She sat at the kitchen table and set the food bag to one side and laid the folder flat. Inside was a letter from the Madison County Building Safety Office. Formal letterhead, official language, direct message. A complaint had been received regarding the structural integrity and occupancy status of the building known as the historic Whit Mill property on Laurel Creek in Madison County, North Carolina. A formal safety inspection was required within 30 days of the date of the letter. If the building was found to be below the minimum standards for occupied residential use, the county would be compelled to proceed with a demolition order. The complaint had been filed by Boyd Sutter of Asheville, North Carolina. The date was 4 days old. Calla read the letter once and folded it back into the folder. Verna, reading over her shoulder, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He isn't going to stop." "No," Calla said, "he isn't." She called Opal at 8 the following Tuesday from the Hot Springs payphone and told her about the homestead patent and the mineral rights and the second Silas letter. She described the patent document in detail, the year the grantor, the language of the mineral rights clause, the fact of no recorded severance in any county document she had been able to locate. Opal listened without interrupting. When Calla finished, she said, "I know someone." A pause. "I'm going to make a call today." The someone was a woman named Margaret Stills, a property rights attorney in Asheville who had spent 20 years handling mineral rights disputes in western North Carolina and who arrived at Whit Mill on a Thursday morning 10 days later, driving a 10-year-old Subaru to the trailhead and hiking in with a canvas day pack and reading glasses on a cord around her neck. She looked at the 1871 homestead patent at the kitchen table and read it completely in silence. Then she read it again. When she set it down and looked up, she said, "Where did you find this?" Calla told her. Margaret Stills took her glasses off. "This is an unsevered mineral rights grant attached to the original homestead patent, she said. It predates any county or state claim to the subsurface resources of this parcel and has never been transferred, sold, or legally extinguished. She looked at the document for another moment. Consolidated Ridge has no access to what is below this land without your written consent. Boyd Sutter has no basis for selling or negotiating what does not belong to him. She put her glasses back on. What you need to do is respond formally to the county safety inspection, which you will pass, given the restoration work you've done, and simultaneously pursue historic preservation status for this building. A structure with this age, this provenance, and this level of documented, continuous use history is a strong candidate. She paused. And I need to prepare a legal notice establishing your mineral rights ownership and put Consolidated Ridge on formal notice of same. Opal coordinated with Eleanor Briggs, who knew the State Historic Preservation Program coordinator, who sent a field representative named Charles Adkins. He was 35 years old and had a digital camera and a clipboard and the focused attention of someone who genuinely cared what he was looking at. He spent 4 hours at the mill in late January, photographing and documenting everything: the stone construction, the surviving millstone mechanism, the restored water wheel, the original fireplace, the chestnut floor with its adze marks, the 1871 homestead patent, Silas Witt's letters, the tin box from the cavity behind the false wall panel. He came back 3 weeks later with a second representative and a better camera, and they stayed for 6 hours. It was the morning after their second visit that Boyd arrived. Calla heard a vehicle on the Forest Service Road at the outer limit of what was audible from the mill, and then 2 sets of footsteps on the trail moving faster than the trail warranted the pace of people used to parking lots who were trying to move quickly on a path that required attention. She came out to the flat front stone and waited. Boyd came around the bend first. He was wearing good clothes, pressed khakis, a buttoned front shirt, a jacket that was not warm enough for February in the mountains. He looked like a man who had prepared for a meeting rather than a trail walk, which told her something about how he had understood what this was going to be. Behind him was a man in his 40s she had not seen before, carrying a leather portfolio, moving with the careful posture of someone who had been told to let his companion lead. Boyd stopped at the edge of the flatstone and looked at the mill. He looked at the roof, the new shingles pale against the old. He looked at the 8 windows with their clean glass. He looked at the water wheel still for the winter, the sluice gate closed, its new paddles visible, the axle repaired, the whole structure solid, in a way it had not been when the county tried to demolish it in 2008 and 2016. He looked at the smoke coming from the chimney. He was recalibrating something, and the recalibration was not going in the direction he had planned for. Then he looked at Calla. Calla, he said. He was aiming for reasonable. He landed at careful. She did not say anything. She stood on the flat stone in front of the mill's front door with her hands at her sides, and she waited. He took 2 steps closer, which brought him to the edge of the flat stone. I know things haven't been handled the way they should have been. His hands found his jacket pockets. I want to make this right. I want to do right by you here. He glanced back at the man with the portfolio. These are people who can fund preservation work, legal protections, everything you'd need to maintain a property like this long term. They work with landowners. What does Consolidated Ridge want? Calla said. Boyd paused. They want to study the subsurface profile of the parcel. It's a scientific study essentially, non-invasive. The subsurface rights are mine, Calla said. They were granted with the original homestead patent in 1871 and have never been transferred. My attorney has documented this and filed the documentation with the county. Consolidated Ridge has no legal access to this property above or below ground without my written consent. She looked at him directly. I haven't given it. Boyd looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his face, not defeat, not yet, but the early movement toward it, the slight rearrangement of certainty that happens when the floor you thought you were standing on begins to feel less solid. He looked past her. Walt Red stood in the mill doorway. He was wearing his canvas work jacket and his boots, and he had both hands at his sides and his weight balanced evenly, and he was not leaning on anything. He was simply present, the way a man who has stood his ground in difficult situations stands his ground without theater, without announcement, in the complete plainness of just being there and being someone who has decided to be there. 89 years old and still in the way that matters, the specific kind of still that tells you the person is not going anywhere. Boyd looked at Walt for a long moment. He looked at the folder under Opal's arm. Opal had come in with Charles Adkins the day before and had stayed, and she was standing slightly to Calla's right with a folder of documents that she held without opening, without reference to it, simply held. He looked at Calla one more time. "There's an offer," he said. His voice was careful now all the way through. $80,000 for the surface rights and exploration access. "No," Calla said. He waited. The cold February air was still around them. A crow somewhere on the hillside above the mill called once and went quiet. She did not reconsider. She stood on the flat stone in front of a building that Ezra Witt had built in 1871 from stones he had selected one at a time from the creek bed, and she looked at Boyd Sutter, and she was not angry, and she was not afraid, and she was not anything except exactly where she was, which was here, and exactly who she was, which was the person who had fixed this roof and these windows and this floor and this wheel, and she was not moving. Boyd Sutter put his hands back in his jacket pockets. He looked at the mill one final time, the roof, the windows, the wheel, the smoke from the chimney, the 8 windows looking back at him with their clear glass. He looked at Walt Red in the doorway. He turned and walked back down the trail, the Consolidated Ridge representative following 2 steps behind, without a word, both of them moving in the direction of the road and whatever came next for them, which was not this. Calla watched them until the trail curved around the granite outcropping and they were gone. She stood there for a moment in the February cold with the creek behind the building and the hemlock branches heavy with the last snow and the smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still air. Then she went inside. Walt had already gone back to what he was doing, which was oiling the hinge assembly on the main gear bracket with the small tin of linseed oil he carried in his canvas bag. Edna came the following Tuesday. She came with a jar of wild cherry preserves, handmade the label in her own careful script. She set the preserves on the windowsill beside the sourwood honey, and she stood in the mill room for a moment, and then she looked at Calla. "I spoke with Margaret Stills," she said. Calla waited. "She told me about both letters." Edna looked at her hands, the hands of a woman who has done physical work all her life, small and knotted and marked with age and still capable. "I would like to read them." Calla got both leather pouches from the inside pocket of her backpack. She set them on the kitchen table upstairs. Edna sat in the chair and unfolded both letters. She read them in the order they had been written, the 1958 letter first, then the 1961 one. She read each one slowly and completely and set each one down on the table when she was done and sat with it for a moment before picking up the next. She sat with the 1961 letter for a long time after she finished. She sat with it in the way you sit with something that tells you something you needed to hear and that also costs something to hear, the way real information always costs something, even when it is the information you have been waiting for. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in its pouch and set the pouch on the table with the first one and placed her hands flat on the table surface and breathed once steadily and looked up. "I have a daughter in Boone," she said, and a granddaughter who is going to law school in September. My father died when I was 3, and I never knew him. My grandfather spent 41 years running this mill for the people of this valley and died never having met me." She paused. "That is a long chain of people missing each other in the dark." She looked at Calla. "I am 84 years old, and I have very little use anymore for missing people in the dark when there is something to be done about it." Margaret Stills drove to the trailhead the following week and hiked in with papers, legal documents reviewed by a second attorney at Edna's request. The documents transferred all of Edna Morse's hereditary rights to the Whit Mill property, all claims she held as the direct lineal descendant of Silas Whit, to Calla Merritt, effective immediately. One condition was written into the legal language at Edna's own instruction, reviewed and approved by both attorneys. The grinding wheel must continue to operate. Edna signed it at the kitchen table in the upstairs room with Calla and Opal and Verna as witnesses. She used a pen she had brought from home and signed her name in the unhurried, deliberate hand of a woman who has made her decision and has no second thoughts about it. 3 weeks after that, a letter arrived at the county post office box Calla had established in Marshall, addressed to Calla Merritt, owner of Record Whit Mill property, Laurel Creek, Madison County, North Carolina. The State Historic Preservation Office had reviewed the documentation submitted by its field representatives and had designated the Whit Mill as a property of state historic significance. The designation carried legal protections against demolition, alteration, or change of use that would affect the character and integrity of the historic structure. The county safety complaint filed by Boyd Sutter had been reviewed in light of the preservation designation and the documented restoration work, and had been dismissed as without merit. That same week, Margaret Stills sent a certified letter to the registered offices of Consolidated Ridge Resources and a copy to Boyd Sutter's address in Asheville. The letter described in the clear and specific language of a property rights attorney who has thought carefully about every sentence the legal status of the mineral rights attached to the Whit Mill parcel, the documented ownership chain from the 1871 homestead patent to the current title holder, and the legal consequences of any survey activity, access, or negotiation regarding those rights without written consent of the title holder. The dark pickup truck did not come back to the trailhead. Spring came to Laurel Creek for the second time since Calla had first walked down its banks on a February morning with a backpack and a borrowed paper bag of bread and cheese. She opened the sluice gate in March on a morning when the snowmelt was running strong and the creek was high and fast, and the air smelled of the particular mineral clarity that moving mountain water gives to the early spring air. The wheel began to turn within 30 seconds of the gate opening, the current hitting the paddles with the enthusiasm of a creek that has been waiting all winter to be useful again. The gear assembly ran, the stones turned, the sound moved through the mill room walls and out through the windows and down the valley, the same sound that had been traveling down this valley every spring for 150 years until 62 years of silence, and now again not silent. She heard it from inside and from outside and from the flat stone at the creek bank and from the bend in the trail 100 yards below the mill, where the sound was audible as a low, steady rumble beneath the creek sound and the bird sound and the general aliveness of the valley in early March. Gus Fenwick brought the season's first grain on a Saturday in April, 50 pounds of heirloom field corn, the variety his family had been keeping for generations. He stood in the mill room and watched Calla feed the first corn through the eye of the upper stone, the grain dropping into the center, opening and disappearing between the turning stones, the note of the grinding changing immediately as the stone found the corn and began the work it had been built to do. He stood with his arms folded for several minutes listening. "That's it," he said finally. "That's the sound." The flour that came from Whit Millstone ground was different from anything that came from the commercial sources, coarser and more complex, the color varying from pale yellow to gold, depending on the variety, the whole grain present in it, with none of the components removed by the industrial process. Anyone who cooked with it could taste the field it had grown in the specific soil and water and weather of this particular mountain valley. The quality that stone ground flour carries from the whole grain that roller milled flour does not. Opal sold it at Grain and Honey, $6 a pound, handwritten label, Whit Millstone ground on the front. The first week's supply sold in 3 days, the second week's in 2. By midsummer, there was a waiting list for the weekly bag, which Calla found both gratifying and slightly overwhelming, because one set of stones can grind only so much corn and wheat in a week, and the demand was beginning to exceed what was possible. A good problem, a problem that Silas Whit had also had in his time and had managed by running the stones longer and sleeping less on the high-demand weeks in the fall. She would manage it the same way. Edna came on Tuesdays, as she had been coming since March. She brought honey and preserves and whatever else she had made or found or decided was worth the walk, and she sat in the upstairs room with Calla and Verna and drank coffee from the cups Calla had found at the Marshall thrift store and talked about her father and what her mother had told her and what the letters said. She talked about what the valley had been like when she was a girl, the farms that were gone now, and the ones still operating, the families that had been here for generations, and the families that had come more recently, the way communities change over a long time, while certain things persist beneath the change. She said one afternoon in June, with the windows open and the creak sound and the grinding sound both present in the room together, that she felt she had finally arrived somewhere she had been traveling toward for most of her life without knowing it. Calla understood this. She did not say so. She poured more coffee, and they sat in the room she had made in the mill that Ezra Whit had built above the creek that had been turning wheels in this valley since before anyone arrived to put one in its path. Walt Red came on Thursdays through the spring and into early summer. He came until the first week of July, when his daughter called the gas station in Hot Springs and left a message for Calla explaining that her father had decided not to make the trail walk any longer. Not because he couldn't, his daughter wanted Calla to know that Walt had been clear about this, but because at 89 he had made a deliberate decision about where to put the strength he had left, and the work at the mill was done, and he had determined that done was done. There was a message. His daughter read it from a piece of paper in Walt's handwriting. Tell her the axle on the lower gear shaft will need attention in about 3 years. Locust is durable but not immortal. She'll know what to do by then. Calla received this at the payphone and stood for a moment with the receiver in her hand, looking at the mountains above the gas station roof. She thought about what it meant to have someone decide that your work was good enough to leave in your hands, that the teaching was complete, that what had been given had taken hold. She knew what to do. In late September, on an evening when the light came through the south window at the angle that meant autumn was coming seriously, Calla brought a new mason jar upstairs. She washed it and dried it and fitted it with a new zinc lid. She sat at the kitchen table and found a pencil in the drawer she had built into the table frame during the 3rd month of the restoration, when she had realized she needed somewhere to put things. She held the pencil for a moment. Then she wrote. She wrote on the blank back cover of the veterinary anatomy textbook, the page she had written her original restoration list, on the list that said roof first, then windows, then floor, joists, then water, then power, then the wheel. She wrote beside and around and above and below the list, filling the page, and when the page was full, she tore it out carefully along the spine and folded it in half, and then in half again, and slid it into the mason jar. My name is Calla Merritt. I was 18 years old and I had nowhere to go, Someone pointed me in a direction, and I followed it, and the direction led here, and here was the place I needed to be. I found $32,200 under the floorboards of this room, and a letter from a man named Silas Witt, who had earned and saved every dollar of it over 41 years of grinding grain for the people of this valley. He asked whoever found it to keep the mill standing. I kept it standing. I fixed the roof and the windows and the floor and the fireplace. I ran a water pipe from the creek and put a solar panel on the south wall. I replaced the wheel paddles and the cracked axle and rehung the wheel on its brackets and reconnected it to the gears and opened the sluice gate, and the wheel turned again after 60 years of stillness. I ground corn for the people of this valley and their families, the same families whose grandparents and great-grandparents had carried grain up this trail for 100 years before me. A woman named Edna, who is 84 years old and is Silas Witt's granddaughter, and who never met him, drove up here one day and walked the trail and stood in this room and put her hands on the turning stone and stood with her eyes closed and heard something she had been waiting 80 years to hear. My mother came in December. She stayed. A man named Walt Red, who is 89 years old and served in Korea, and who came every Thursday for 4 months to help restore the gear assembly, left a message saying, "The lower shaft axle will need attention in 3 years. I will be ready." If you are reading this, you found the loose boards near the fireplace and lifted them. You reached into the dark and found something. The wheel is still turning. Keep it turning. Calla Merritt. She sealed the jar. She went downstairs. She lifted the loose boards near the fireplace, the boards that Silas Witt had prepared in 1957 or 1958 with the patience and precision that characterized everything. He built the boards that had covered the wooden crate for 62 years and had been lifted by her hands the February morning she had arrived, the first person to lift them since the man who laid them. She set the boards aside and placed the mason jar in the cavity alone. Now, no crate, no 12 jars beside it, just one jar in the space where they had all been, and replaced the boards one by one, pressing each one flat, running her palm across the surface until the floor was seamless again. She stood up. She walked to the south window and looked out at the September forests, the maples beginning to turn red at the high elevations, the creek visible through the trees below its surface, catching the late afternoon light in pieces. That is the thing about stone. Stone does not require anyone's opinion of it. It does not adjust itself to the preferences of the surrounding landscape or seek recognition from the people who pass through it. It holds what it holds, bears what it bears, and continues to stand because that is what it was made to do and because nothing has happened to it sufficient to make it stop. Witt Mill had been built from stones pulled from the creek bed in 1871 by a man who trusted stone more than he trusted anything that could be printed on paper or spoken in a bank. It had stood through floods and drought and hard winters and 2 attempted demolitions by a county that had stopped believing in it. It had held Silas Witt's savings for 62 years without losing a dollar. It had held his letter without losing a word. It was standing now. The roof was sound. The windows were clear. The floor was clean and warm. Underfoot, the wheel was turning. The flour from its stones was in the bags at Grain and Honey, the Witt name on the label, the valley's corn and wheat becoming the valley's bread, the way it had become the valley's bread for 150 years, 1 bushel at a time, 1 family at a time, 1 grinding stone, making contact with another grinding stone, and the grain becoming what the grain was always meant to become. Calla Merritt was 18 years old when Boyd Sutter put her belongings in a garbage bag and changed the locks and turned back to his game show. She had a backpack, a 1922 silver dollar, and $204 in small bills. She followed a direction someone gave her, and she walked 2 miles into the mountains, and she pushed past a broken door and found a building that had been waiting without knowing it was waiting, and she bought it for $10 from the county tax roll, and she spent the next 11 months fixing it. It was the best $10 that had ever been spent in Madison County, North Carolina, not because of what the $10 purchased in the legal sense, but because of what the $10 began: the roof and the windows and the floor and the wheel and the grinding and the flour and the sound that traveled down the valley on still mornings and reached people on their porches before they were fully awake and reminded them of something they had not known they were missing. What does it mean to be small? Asked the creek. It is narrow enough to jump across, in most places shallow enough in summer to see every stone on the bottom. But it has been shaping this valley since before anyone arrived to put a building in its path. It does not force, it does not fight. It finds the direction available to it and commits to that direction fully and keeps moving, and over time patient and unhurried and absolutely certain of its own necessity, it changes the shape of the world. That is the thing about people who have been made small by someone else's choices. They do not break. They find the way through. They keep moving in the direction they can move, and the direction they can move turns out eventually to lead somewhere worth going. And they build something, not with permission, not with fanfare, not with anything except what is available and the stubbornness to keep working with it. They build something that lasts. The wheel turned, the stones turned, the creek ran beneath everything steady and cold and present, the same water it had always been, always passing through and always arriving, and the sound of it rose through the fitted granite of the mill floor and filled the room above it and the room above that, and went out through the 8 windows and down through the forest and into the valley, and the valley heard it, the way valleys hear the things that have always belonged to them when those things come back.